Okay, so welcome back here. We're going to move on to something really completely different from last time. And that is to say, we're going to talk about reproduction here. Now, when we talk about reproduction, there's lots of different avenues that we can go with this. What we're going to be studying here are going to be things like, potentially, we could study, I guess I should put that, because we're not going to cover all the stuff, but potentially we could cover things like, say, mate association. How do we find a mate? How do we pick one out? All that kind of stuff. The annual reproductive cycle. Most animals are on a reproductive cycle. There's a mating season, a calving season, things like that. So how do we control cycles? How do we do the processes that we associate with reproduction, right? So how do we generate gametes? How do we generate reproductive organs? All of that kind of stuff, how those get differentiated, all those fun things. How do we provision for offspring? A lot of animals do provision for their offspring. They don't all have to be mammals, right? There's lots of different ways we can do that. We can look at how a lot of young, juveniles, larvae, things like that are distinctive physiologically from the adults, all that kind of stuff. One thing that we are really going to kind of shy away from here a little bit is with mechanism. There's really two kinds of ways that this can happen. There's sexual reproduction, which involves a male and a female. And then we're seeing surprisingly a lot of called parthenogenesis, particularly with reptiles. And partheno comes from the Greek word, well, it means female parts, basically. It's also where Parthenon comes from. Read into that what you want to. But parthenogenesis is basically reproduction without a male. So we see it a lot in reptiles where they're just spontaneously having offspring, which is pretty cool, honestly, but not a thing that we're going to spend a lot of time with. What we are going to talk about, though, in terms of reproductive processes are things like how many times are we going to do it, okay? We could talk about seminal parity, and here is where I would like to be able to write something, and maybe I'm going to be able to do that. Pen, sweet, I do. So we have, it's going to work, there we go. This is going to be worse than my usual handwriting. Seminal parity. And hetero parity. And I'm not going to write the rest of that out, but it's just parity. Basically, the idea between seminal parity and heteroparity, seminiparous organisms are organisms that only reproduce once. They get one shot at it, right? Now, these might be things that are relatively short-lived, like mayflies. They only live through one mating season. Or they're going to be things that maybe live a little bit longer, right? Octopi, most octopi are seminiparous, things like salmon, but they're only going to undergo one reproductive season. The cost of reproduction is so high that they just generally don't survive it. Now, that's not to say they never do. Some salmon, not very many, but some salmon do survive past their first reproductive season, but generally speaking, the idea is that they end up dying in the process of doing that. Whereas something like heteroparous organisms survive the mating season, right? They can try again next year, right? That's heteroparity. Usually with seminiparous organisms, sometimes with heteroparity, but generally we associate this with seminiparity. We get the development of what's called, I was really happy with that E until the middle there. What's called an epitoke. K-E. And what we're seeing here with this salmon is an epitoke. This is a distinctive reproductive morphology, right? So when we look at, say, sockeye salmon here, number one, they turn this bright red color, but also males, their mouth forms this weird hook-like beak thing. And the thing with this is that it's apparently attractive to females, but it also prevents them from eating, right? So for this salmon, he's done eating. He's going to live off whatever he's got in store here, and that's all he's got. They don't have to be this way. It just has to be some special mating morphology associated with this kind of behavior. But this is kind of the classic example of what one of those things is. For provisioning, going back to kind of the slide that we had at the very beginning, this can be anything, right? This can be stuff like yolk sacs. So here we've got some sharks, and these are yolk sacs with these sharks. Now, you may or may not know this. Most sharks are viviparous, okay? Again, I'm going to hold my pen. Viviparous, which is to say they give birth to live young, okay? Now, sharks are viviparous, but they still have yolk sacs attached to their embryos. Obviously, sharks don't have a placenta. They're not mammals, right? So they still have to have some means of providing for the young, and that's what the yolk sac is. They just don't develop in an external egg. That's all that is. Some other examples of this sort of provisioning behavior in non-placental mammals include things like allowing for cannibalism, right? When there's a large amount, particularly with invertebrates, where we see they just have a lot of young, and the first ones to hatch eat their siblings. And that's their means of providing food for those young. Just kind of horrible. Placental transport, obviously we think about in mammals as being a provisioning thing. And provisioning can continue on post-birth, right? So food gathering behavior in birds, lactation, breastfeeding in mammals, all that kind of stuff still falls under the bin of provisioning. For most animals, right, we talk about the idea of a reproductive cycle, okay? And the idea behind the cycle is tied to seasonality, right? There are seasons that are good to have young. There are seasons that are good to reproduce because you have just fed and you're fat and happy, right? And the idea behind these cycles is to try to tie the major events, the life history events, mating, birth, all that kind of stuff, to those happy seasons, basically. For some animals, it's really hard to make that happen, right? The overwintering period is too long to expect survival, all these kinds of things. And so we end up adding in what's called a diapause. And a diapause, so we see here in the silkworm, we see it also in fur seals. A diapause is just any pause in the reproductive cycle, right? Delayed embryonic development is basically what this ends up being. So for our fur seals, for example, they're going to give birth very, very early in summer so that their young can go off and grow and survive long enough to get here through winter. But they're going to also mate really closely to that birth period, right? Conception is going to happen right after birth. But then they're going to undergo delayed implantation. They're going to put a pause on the development of that new offspring. And they're going to pause it right up until the middle of autumn, okay? And the reason for that is that placental development, right, post-implantation is about 250 days. And so they want to set that 250-day time point, okay, 250 days prior to the onset of spring. Okay, so they need this couple of month delay in order to make that work. For our silkworms, right, this diapause is externally controlled. It's about temperature, right? So as we saw before with ecdysis and all that kind of stuff, we talk about their cycle. We need a period of warmth so that we can hatch around the same time that mulberry leaves are beginning to green up. So again, diapause really drives a lot of that. Now, as we get farther and farther away from seasonality, we get farther and farther away from there being a distinctive reproductive cycle, right? So here we've got little dormice, and this little arc here we've got is our reproductive cycle timing. The area under the curve is the percentage of females that are pregnant, right? And up here in the high latitudes, we find that there's a very distinctive season for reproduction, right? And a very distinctive season where there is nothing going on. Okay, this is tied, of course, to the fact that there's a very short, nice season all the way up here in Yakutsk. Okay, but as we get closer and closer and closer to the equator and less seasonality, right? It's more or less always the same down here in southern Mexico, right? Weather doesn't really change a whole lot. There's no reason to have a distinct reproductive cycle. Any time is as good as now, right? There's no time like the present. And so there's a pretty much continuous period of reproduction for all of these little dormice. Again, because there's no bad season. Now, like I said, we're talking here primarily about sexual reproduction. We're thinking here mostly about males versus females, right? Go away, buddy. Mostly about males and females here. So, sorry, I've got some company. And while normally those things are set in stone, right, there are going to be opportunities for sex change to occur in the wild. Now, this occurs in all kinds of different things. It happens a lot in fish. You see it happen in snails, like gastropods. You see it in annelid worms. And generally what happens is what's called sequential hermaphroditism. You start off as one sex and then become the other. And a lot of this can be related to size, right? So particularly with fish, where there's non-deterministic growth. The older you are, the bigger you are. Like you and me, we get to a certain size and we stop growing. Fish don't work that way. And in some fish species, there's a really dramatic advantage to being really big, right? So say if you're a male and you're small, you're out of luck, okay? But if you start off life as female, it doesn't matter. The male will mate with any size female, okay? But as you grow and grow and grow and get bigger and bigger and bigger, eventually it becomes more advantageous to you to become male instead. And so you will switch from one to the other. And that's really, really, really common in these species that have this non-deterministic or continuous growth. The system that we understand the best is the mammalian system, because it's what we are, right? And so that's really the part that we're going to focus on here the most with our kind of envisioning of reproductive cycles. So here we've got the female placental, female human placental in this particular case. All of the nice magic moving parts here. Right, so we've got a uterus here, which is going to eventually become the home for any offspring that we might encounter. We have a canal here, the vaginal canal, through which we can have internal fertilization. We have a cervix kind of guarding the door between the uterus and the vagina. And all of these parts here are kind of just there for fertilization and post-fertilization. The remainder of the female reproductive system here has to do with the oviduct, okay, and the ovary themselves. And the ovaries here, of course, are the female gonad, okay, and they are going to produce eggs, right, ovae. And the process of maturation of these ovae is pretty complicated. We're not going to go too far into it. I don't really want to go too far into it because it does tend to vary a little bit in terms of the timing between different sorts of animals and stuff like that. But an egg is basically going to follow the same basic set of procedures, okay? We're going to start off life as a primordial follicle. We're going to grow into a primary follicle. And as we grow from a primary follicle into a secondary follicle, what we're going to end up with is a little hollow open space inside here called an antrum. And that antrum is going to help separate the eventual egg from a surrounding bit of tissue called a follicle, right? And as it turns out, both of these parts are going to be essential for the implantation development of a placental organism, right? The release of the oocyte, okay, from the ovary itself is called ovulation. And what actually does happen is the follicle and the exterior margin of the ovary actually ruptures and actually expels the egg from the ovary. Now, the remainder of the cycle doesn't go away. It actually stays around behind as a structure called the corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum is going to play a really, really important role in the menstrual cycle and allowing for implantation to occur. But we'll see all of that stuff later on. This oocyte literally just gets shot off into space. And if we look at kind of how this is working here, right, we have an ovary that's not directly connected to the oviduct, right? It's got these little fimbriae kind of surrounding it that can help guide an egg into this oviduct, but it could just as easily end up out here in the pelvic cavity. And in fact, it often does, right? It's not entirely unlikely that any ovulated egg never makes it into the reproductive system at all, right? Once it ends up out here, it just kind of gets degraded. It doesn't really become anything. It goes away. It's not a big deal. Now, as to how ovulation actually happens, there are two different ways this can happen. So one of the ways that this happens that we're mostly familiar with, I'm going to go pen back out here, is what we call spontaneous ovulation. It's a delightful bit of handwriting. This spontaneous ovulation here, it doesn't mean your partner surprised you with a bottle of wine and a video rental, right? It's not that kind of spontaneous, although I suppose it could happen. This simply just means that there's not an event that triggers it, right? An external event that triggers it. So this is what humans do, for example. You have a 28-day monthly cycle, right, that you ovulate on cue, right, roughly every 28 days. Okay, that's spontaneous ovulation. The other variety of this is what we're seeing here with this little rabbit, is called induced ovulation. That's a C, believe it or not. Induced ovulation. And with induced ovulation, there is some external cue that triggers ovulation. So here in our rabbit, for example, that cue is actually copulation, right? So a rabbit doesn't ovulate until the act of copulation. We see this in things like big cats, right? One of the reasons that a lion will kill all of the young if it takes over a pride, not only because it doesn't want to waste its resources taking care of somebody else's kids, but also that will induce ovulation in the female lions. So it's a very different system, but both of them ultimately end up in the same place. So what's happening here during the female reproductive cycle? We can really kind of divide it up into 3 chunks out of our 28-day cycle, right? We're going to begin here with the menstrual phase, so day 0. This is going to be the onset or the shedding or the sloughing of the inner part of the uterus, the endometrium. And that's what menstrual flow is. And this can last, maybe 5 days or so. While this is happening, not really much else is going on. We are starting to continue the development of our ovae, right? We're moving forward piece by piece here, but we are not fully maturing. And in fact, what we're going to find is that the egg doesn't actually even complete meiosis unless it's fertilized, right? So they might never actually complete meiosis altogether. Following this menstrual phase, we begin the proliferative phase, where we begin to rebuild that endometrium that we just got rid of. Seems dumb, but that's mammals for you, right? While this is happening, okay, we're going to see a surge in estrogen from the ovary. So here are some ovarian hormones. Estrogen begins to spike, and that spike of estrogen induces what we call estrus or heat. So if you have a cat and she is not fixed, she's probably going around every so often and being a real pain in the ass, right? Trying to advertise to every tomcat in the neighborhood. That's what heat is, right? And that's what this spike of estrogen does. Now, not every organism undergoes this, but this is what's happening here. Meanwhile, we're seeing trigger of some other hormones here from the anterior pituitary, particularly luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. These two hormones here are going to trigger ovulation, right? The release of the ovum from the follicle. Now, the final phase here, the remainder of our period, about 2 weeks here, can be the secretory phase. Here, we see an immediate diminishment of luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormone. Ovulation is done. We don't need to worry about it. But a surge in progesterone. Okay, progesterone here, both from the ovary and also from this corpus luteum. And what this progesterone is going to do is it's going to maintain this endometrium. And the sloughing or the removal of this endometrium during the menstrual phase is triggered by a drop-off in progesterone. Okay, so progesterone is going to be a relatively important hormone here for maintaining this endometrium. Here on the male side, not a lot of moving parts here, really, honestly, either. Our gonad instead here on the male side is the testis, or the testes, or the testicle. All terms apply. And the thing with the testicle, if you want to call it that, is that we are directly connected now to the actual piping, right? There's no chance that a sperm is going to float off somewhere else. It's directly connected here, first via the epididymis, and then we're actually going to see a lot of proliferation of the sperm, and then to the vas deferens and all the piping all the way out through eventually the urethra. Now, in terms of mammalian sex differentiation, a lot of this stuff happens in utero, right? And what our big key here is going to be is an early dose or not of testosterone, right? So around week 11, 12, 13, up to like week 17, we need a big dose of testosterone. If that happens, we become male. If it doesn't happen, we remain female, okay? And then usually with males, there's another little spike here immediately after birth in the first year. Why? No. And then nothing until pubescence. And then testosterone takes off and life is never the same again, I guess. Now, what's happening physically here is we begin with essentially undifferentiated genitals, undifferentiated gonads, okay? And depending on whether we get that dose of testosterone or not, the same parts become male or female, okay? So we start with a genital tubercle, a urethral groove, okay? And then a labioscrotal swelling kind of surrounding that. If we get the dose of testosterone, right, these parts become the male parts. This genital tubercle becomes the glands. The urethral groove unites to form the shaft of the penis. The labioscrotal swelling becomes the scrotum. Okay. On the female side, on the other hand, if we don't get that dose of testosterone, our genital tubercle becomes the clitoris. The urethral groove remains open. Okay. And we end up developing from both the labioscrotal swelling and the urethral fold, the labia minora and the labia majora on the outside there. Internally, right, what's going to happen is, again, we're going to start from an undifferentiated system. We're going to have what's called an indifferent gonad, which will become either an ovary or a testicle, okay, and two sets of tubes. We have a Müllerian duct, which you'll see here is not connected to the gonad, and a Wolffian duct here in orange, which you see is. If we get the testosterone, the Wolffian duct becomes the epididymis, the vas deferens, all of those parts, okay, and the Müllerian duct goes away. If we don't get it, the Müllerian duct becomes the oviduct, and the Wolffian ducts go away. All right, so again, really, you can maybe see here that where there's a lot of room for things to kind of not go according to plan, right? There's a lot of slipperiness here that might be potentially there. So when we think about things like intersex people, when we think about things that like transgender people, all of those sorts of things, this is all just kind of possible, right? There's a lot of room in here for some wacky things to happen. I don't mean to imply that transgender or transsexual people or anything like that are wacky. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm simply trying to say here is that there's a lot of potential for things to not neatly fall into one category or the other. It's really, really easy to kind of be halfway on one side and halfway on the other, or any variation in between. One thing that's interesting here is that there is a very large distinction between reproductive effort in males and females. Females, particularly female mammals, but females across all species, bear a lot of the responsibility. It's very costly for them to reproduce, right? They provide a large cell. They provide, the way that meiosis works is that they get, out of the whole process, they get one gamete at the end of it. All of the organelles, all of that stuff, they have to provide in some way, shape, or form for provisioning, be it yolk, be it a placenta, whatever, okay? Males, on the other hand, from meiosis, we get 4 gametes. They're small, they're not costly. We don't necessarily have to have any role post-fertilization. In fact, a lot of male animals don't, right? And so costs are pretty small, right? And so surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, whenever we can, we're going to downsize our gonads, right? Where we can't is when our mating system rewards putting out a lot of gametes, okay? So here we're looking at mammals across the board, all mammals, and then here just primates, and 2 different mating systems, right? So if we have a mating system with just one male and maybe one or maybe a lot of different females, it doesn't really behoove us to have big gonads, right? There's no reason for us to have them. There's no competition, right? But where there are a lot of males, a lot of potential competition, we find that gonads are really big, right? For a couple of different reasons. Number one, the bigger the gonad, the more testosterone that's produced and the more male characteristics that come out. So if there's physical competition, that can be a help. But also we produce more sperm with a bigger gonad, right? And so if there's a possibility of multiple mating events, we run into a situation where we're trying to outcompete not only outside the fertilization event, but also within the fertilization event. That can be a boon to us there as well. So assuming fertilization actually happens, right? Magic occurs, you will see all kinds of cutesy little things. You know, if you feel bad about yourself, remember you're the sperm that won. You're actually not the sperm that won. And that's a good thing, right? Because the first sperm to arrive at the egg doesn't actually get in, right? The ovum itself is surrounded by this cloud of granulosa, this massive wad of crap, right? And sperm, when they arrive, begin to kind of work their way through it, but a lot of them don't get there. They have to digest their way through there. Eventually, though, right, one will work its way all the way through and will actually get to the oocyte itself. Once it does so, right, it's going to continue kind of dissolving it, and we're going to have to get our way through what's called the zona pellucida, this outermost layer of the oocyte, right, to actually get in and get to the egg itself. So what happens here is we bind to it, okay, and once we bind to it, we begin what's called the acrosomal reaction. The acrosomal reaction does 2 things. Number one, it allows the sperm to digest its way through this zona pellucida and actually access the oocyte, but it also shuts off all of these other receptors, okay? This is going to prevent multiple sperm from fertilizing the same egg, right? The reason we care about that is if multiple sperm fertilize the same egg, now we don't end up with 2 copies of the genes that we want in there. We end up with 3 or 4, whatever. Trisomy, things like that are bad. They tend to be fatal. Okay, so we want to make sure 1 sperm, 1 egg, that's it. So this acrosomal reaction helps to ensure that by shutting off all of these receptor molecules on the zona pellucida so that the first one in is the last one. It's called the cortical reaction. That's what this is called. One last thing here that's happened, I forgot to mention this. So I said at the very beginning of this that the oocyte doesn't actually complete meiosis until fertilization. The fusing of the sperm with the oocyte actually moves us finally into the last stages of meiosis. We finally complete that. We end up fully formed then as an ovum. Now, why on earth do we care about that placenta? Why do we care about that follicle? The reason we care about that is that it is going to be the primary source for progesterone. Okay, and again, remember, progesterone is what's going to keep that endometrium from being shed. Okay, now, early on in pregnancy, right, we don't have a lot of options for progesterone production. Okay. The only thing that's really going to make that happen is the corpus luteum, that remainder of that follicle. So we need it to stick around. Okay, so immediately after fertilization, we're going to begin secreting a hormone called chorionic gonadotropin, or CG. Here for humans, it's HCG. And human chorionic gonadotropin spikes really, really early on. Okay, and what it does is it simply prevents the corpus luteum from being broken down. It continues to allow it to make and maintain the endometrium by producing progesterone. Now, eventually we don't need it anymore, right? Eventually we're going to develop a placenta, and the placenta is going to take over production of these hormones. So as the placenta begins, right, we decline our levels of HCG, the corpus luteum goes away, progesterone continues to spike, but here it's driven by the placenta. One of the things that we use as pregnancy tests, for example, is chorionic gonadotropin. Because we have such a massive dose of it in your blood, we get rid of it. Somehow we actually get rid of it through the urine, which is why you pee on a stick to take a pregnancy test. Now, as we move on, we continue through our process of pregnancy, okay? Eventually, kids got to come out, right? We eventually have to get through this whole process, which we're going to call parturition. Again, you'll have to bear with me as I draw this. Parturition. You never thought you would miss me writing on the board, but here we are. So parturition is just birth, okay? And the driving of parturition, of birth here, is a series of rhythmic contractions of the uterus, here driven entirely, there's a lot of things going on here, driven by oxytocin, okay? That's going to be our primary driver for birth, for parturition. The very last thing we're talking about here with mammals here, obviously with mammals we have postpartum nursing, okay, lactation. Lactation here is driven by, again, by prolactin and by oxytocin. Okay, prolactin here, we're secreting milk, we're getting rid of milk. Oxytocin here is causing us to produce milk. So oxytocin, we produce milk, we inject it here into the sort of the lumen of our mammary gland. Prolactin causes us to eject it out into the duct so that the offspring can have it. Okay, so we'll call it good there. We will come back and we'll talk about something completely different in the next set of videos. But until then, good luck.